Good morning. I hope that you've already encountered God this morning. I wonder how many of you have had like a tangible experience with God. Have any of you have you ever seen an angel? Like, I married an angel, so it's an everyday occurrence for me. But a bunch. But just trying to earn some points, that's all. But I often wonder, like, as you read through the Old Testament, the amazing encounters that people had with God, right? And we've got one this morning with Moses in the burning bush. But that's not on its own, right? There are many times when God's people encounter God in amazing, tangible ways. Well, why don't we see that so much today? And to be honest with you, which is kind of important that I'm honest with you, I feel that if somebody told me a story about a burning bush and a voice spoke to them out of it, I'd be a little bit skeptical. But what we've also got to remember is that there was a purpose to the Old Testament. And God had a purpose for his people. And we're talking about a span of many centuries, from Abraham to Jesus. Now, we're not talking about a lifetime, we're talking about many lifetimes. We've probably only got a glimpse of what God did with his people. But it's a glimpse that tells us something about the nature of who he is. So I want to talk about where we left off last week. Kevin mentioned that Moses was conflicted. Is he a Hebrew or was he an Egyptian? He's born a Hebrew, he's brought up an Egyptian. But when he saw an Egyptian beaten up on a Hebrew and he went and killed the Egyptian, I think Pharaoh's reaction is really telling. Pharaoh wanted Moses dead. So I'm guessing Pharaoh saw Moses as a Hebrew and definitely not as a grandson. So Moses runs away to Midian, and meanwhile, while Moses is in Midian, this is what we read about at the first passage there, Yvonne. So this is the end of chapter 2. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. Some interesting wording there, like the groans of the Israelites came up to God, and then God remembered his covenant. Some interesting wording, right? And maybe we read more into that than we need to. Maybe that meant something specific to those Hebrews, those Israelites, as they would read that later. But it makes you ask the question: how much is too much? Right? How much persecution is too much? And does the God of the Hebrews care? Maybe Egypt's gods are more powerful than the Hebrew God. Now, the Egyptians are doing well for themselves. The Hebrews, not so much. So then we find ourselves in Exodus chapter 3, beginning at verse 1, today's passage. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called out to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, "Here I am." Then he said, "Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground." And he said, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. All right, let's have that map up there, please, Yvonne. All right, so this is Google Maps. This is the area that we're talking about. I thought if we did like a big zoom out, we'd be able to see the area that we're talking about. That's modern day. Some of the labels there are modern day countries or areas. And then if you go to the next one, Yvonne. And here we get more of a picture of what it was like for Moses, that he'd gone from Egypt, which is in the top left there. He'd gone all the way to Midian in the bottom right. And as he's feeding the flock, well, I guess he went round the Gulf of Aqaba and ended up at the wilderness of Sin there, right? But that's where we find Mount Horeb, otherwise known as Mount Sinai, right? So that just gives you an idea of the lay of the land when Moses was when we were reading about Moses in Exodus. So Moses had run away to Midian. He'd met his wife. He'd inherited a father-in-law. Chapter 2, we find his name is Reuel, which means God shall pasture, not pastor. God shall pasture, because he was a shepherd. And then in chapter 3, his name is changed to Jethro, which means overflow, and that's all I can tell you about that. I don't know why he changed his name, but it's kind of an interesting transition there. And we're told that he was the priest of Midian. And both Kevin and Wikipedia agree on this, so the two great sources of truth agree on this, that probably the Midianites worshipped Yahweh. And that kind of makes sense because Midian was the son of Abraham, and his mother was Keturah, who Abraham married after Sarah had died. And you see that in Genesis 25. So it makes sense that when Moses ran away to Midian, he'd actually run away to seminary. His father-in-law was the priest, probably of Yahweh. What did God have in mind for Moses? So Moses heads west. He's looking after his father-in-law's sheep, and he heads west, and he ends up in the region of Horeb, and the name is interchangeable with Sinai, and it means the mountain of God, or that's what they called that mountain. It was the mountain of God. I don't know if Moses knew this, and he's like, well, I know there's a mountain over here called the mountain of God. I'm going to go and experience that. Or if he ended up there, and then we've been told later that this is the mountain of God. But that's where Moses ends up. And there's this idea of a place where heaven and earth meet. And obviously, it makes sense that that would be the top of the mountain because it's the closest to the heavens, right? So that was the idea of the mountain of God. It would be the place where heaven and earth meet. It's called an axis mundi, if you like the, I was going to say Italian, Latin name for it. Okay, so what's Moses doing? How come he ended up at this mountain? What has God got planned for him? We're told that the angel of the Lord appeared in a flame of fire. And I think, that's a bit of a spoiler alert, because when you consider this from the point of view of Moses, forget that it's the angel of the Lord, right? Forget that, because what does Moses see? He sees a burning bush, and he thinks, this is intriguing because it's not actually being consumed by the flames. I'm going to go and see what's going on here. So a voice calls from the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses says, here I am. Not, who said that? Back in Genesis 22, Abraham has got Isaac at the top of a different mountain, Mount Moriah, which becomes Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And he's just about to sacrifice Isaac. If you don't know the story, it's quite troubling, but we're not going to go into it this morning. But he's just about to sacrifice Isaac. And the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And Abraham says, here I am. Right, so we've got this great parallel. Abraham, who had been in pretty much constant communication with God up to this point, God calls to him and he says, here I am. And we've got Moses. We don't really know where he stood in his religion. But when he hears this voice, his response isn't, who was that? Or what the heck was that? I mean, we get told the response was, here I am. So maybe, like Abraham, Moses actually recognized that voice. So Moses thinks that there's a bush on fire, but it turns out to be much more than that. Who or what is this voice that's talking to him? Is it an angel? And we've got to look at this from Moses' point of view, right? We've already been told a little bit too much. But for Moses, he's told, do not come near. Take your sandals off, for the place on which you're standing is holy ground. Why? Why is it holy ground? This is actually the first mention of holy outside of the seventh day of creation. This is the first time when something has been called holy outside of the Sabbath. There's no law yet. There's no sacrificial system. So who gets to make the decision whether something is holy or not? The next thing we're told is that the voice tells Moses, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And I kind of feel like you can't be much more explicit than that. This voice is saying, I am the God of the Hebrews. But also, and we can't miss this, he doesn't say, I am the God of your fathers. He says, I am the God of your father. Which one? I'm not sure how much Moses knew of Amram, his earthly father. But maybe this is Levi, the tribe, the father of the tribe that he was from, the priestly tribe. But maybe this is Jethro, his father-in-law. That's how God is introducing himself to Moses. What he's saying is, Moses, you're a Hebrew, I'm your God. Moses' immediate reaction is he hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. There was recognition. Moses joined the dots to the God that he already knew. So who's talking to Moses out of the bush? Later, he identifies himself as I am, or Yahweh. So there's little doubt to us who this is. This is God himself, the God of the Hebrews. And we're told he's remembered his people and he's come down to rescue them. He remembered, like there he was in heaven and he just kind of like forgot his people. But then they cry out and eventually they kind of shake him out of his rest. They wake him up and he comes down to this, I've got to do something now because they've been shouting my name. That's the picture that it gives us, right? That is the picture of a distant God. A God who just turns up when he's needed. But really what that language does, it describes God in the language of the time, the ancient Near East. This is what gods do. They turn up when they're needed. And we got a great picture of that with Elijah and the Baal worshippers when he's like, well, maybe you need to shout louder because he's fallen asleep, or maybe he's in the bathroom or whatever, right? It's just kind of like that thing of, you've got to wake him from his slumber so that he can come down and do something. That's what we see if we just take that snapshot from Exodus. If we look at the Bible as a whole, the Bible gives us a picture of a God who never leaves his people. Now, we've got the name given to who the voice is, and it's the angel of the Lord. And that's an interesting phrase. And if you look at where else that's used, it's predominantly in the Old Testament. There's only one time in the New Testament the angel of the Lord told Abraham, hold up, Abraham, you don't need to sacrifice Isaac. He speaks to Moses from the burning bush. Balaam meets him on the road talking donkeys and all kinds of stuff. But that wasn't the angel of the Lord, but the donkey saw the angel of the Lord before Balaam did. Gideon's commission was from the angel of the Lord. Elijah, when he's fleeing from Jezebel, met the angel of the Lord. David, when he was hiding from Solomon, met the angel of the Lord. And Joseph, the earthly father of Jesus, met with the angel of the Lord in a vision. So each time, you've got a manifestation of Yahweh, the God of Israel, guiding someone to lead his people. Each time God comes down to lead and guide his people. In the Old Testament, it seems like God manifested when people really needed him, like literally came down from heaven and then seemingly disappeared. But the reality is that he appeared when people needed him. They could find him, but then they got comfortable. And then the people no longer recognized him. And that went on, a cycle after cycle after cycle. So at the top I asked, how much is too much, and does the God of the Hebrews care? And the answer is yes, enough to come down from heaven and dwell among the leaders of his people, Moses in this instance. But then 1,300 years later, God came down from heaven and made his dwelling among all his people. The same God who met Moses in the burning bush. Then when he was crucified, resurrected, and ascended to heaven, he hadn't left. 10 days later, when the day of Pentecost arrived, they were all together in one place. And suddenly there came from heaven a sound like a mighty rushing wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. And divided tongues as of fire appeared to them and rested on each one of them, and they were filled with the Holy Spirit. There's that fire again. It's the same fire that appeared to Moses because it's the same God. And the same Spirit is with us today. God has never left his people, but his people often leave him. God would often raise up another leader to maintain a faithful remnant until his redemption plan of Jesus was in place. And in Hebrews chapter 3, we read that Jesus is the greater Moses. Moses was faithful in the house of God as a servant, but Jesus as a son. Moses was a Levite, the priests of Israel. And in Hebrews 4, we're told that Jesus is the great high priest. Moses mediated the law with Israel, and in Hebrews chapters 8 and 9, we read that Jesus is the mediator of a better covenant. See, Jesus is the fulfillment of the Levite priestly role. He's the fulfillment of the law. God reconciles his people back to him through Jesus, not an as and when needed reconciliation, but an always, all-time, everyone reconciliation. How do we know that God cares for his people? Well, Jesus, just before his crucifixion, said, "Not my will, but yours be done." He went to the cross and he died regardless of whether or not we choose that reconciliation with God through him. Rejecting Jesus doesn't change any of that. He still would have died for you. But accepting him changes everything. God had never changed. In John chapter 8, Jesus says, "Before Abraham was, I am." And John tells us that the Word was there in the beginning. The God who created everything, led his people out of Egypt, led his people to the promised land, is the same God who died for you on the cross and lives with us today through his Spirit. So, why didn't God save the Hebrews earlier from their slavery? Do you think it could possibly be because they didn't ask him to? Do you think they were actually quite comfortable until that point? Maybe they didn't even remember him. Does that sound familiar? Maybe God should be the first place that we turn rather than just in desperation. Never underestimate comfort and the damage that it can do to our relationship with him. But know that when you cry out to God, he does listen and is with you. Because even when we're not, he is faithful to his people.